Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And today is a very exciting day for us and all of our collaborators on this series from a host of other universities. We started a few weeks ago to think about how we can best support and help our young colleagues, our assistant professors, postdocs, and researchers in this time where they can't travel to conferences or give talks. And so we came up with this shared seminar series. And what I'm really excited about today is to share with you a conversation by Professor Gabe Chan from the University of Minnesota. Selfishly, I was on the hiring committee that brought Gabe to University of Minnesota from MIT, and I've been following and really excited with his career and development ever since. And his creation of energy research and his engagement on these topics, and even with a Public Utilities Commission, has really evolved over the years. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. There's a question and answer box that you can type your questions in the future. We'll wait another minute or so to let people come in. But Gabe, if you want to introduce a little bit more about yourself or your context right now, we also appreciate that we're having this conversation at a really hard time in our nation's history, and we're all very cognizant to the pain that a lot of us are feeling right now, and want to just note our presence here at this time talking about this topic in no way diminishes our concern for the conversations and challenges around our country today. So with that, Gabe Chan.
Everyone, thanks for that great introduction, Elizabeth. I also wanted to acknowledge where we are in the world today, and particularly, I work in Minneapolis, where a lot of this has really taken off and really affected a lot of the students and staff and colleagues at the University of Minnesota, and it's been extremely challenging. I think that this is it's a hard time, and having the privilege to be able to step back and think about electricity policy, I think, is really something that I've been reconsidering over the last few weeks with what's gone on in Minneapolis and across the country, but also over a longer time period with the public health epidemic we're in. And I think even more broadly than that, just recognizing now having been in this position at Minnesota for 5 years, the incredible amount of privilege and latitude that you get as a young faculty member and what you can do with that. I'll talk a little bit about this in my talk, but I think another really important part of what I've reflected on this time has been being at a public university, being at a land-grant university, and what kinds of not just opportunities but responsibilities as a faculty member in this position, and how to navigate that. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the work, and maybe Elizabeth, I'll just wait for your go ahead when you think we should get started. Looks like a few more people are joining, but we're 5 past now, so I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. And hopefully now you can see a title slide. So I titled my slide Cooperative Electric Cooperative Research. And what I want to do today in about half an hour is talk through a lot of the work that I've been doing with many collaborators and students to do engaged research around electric cooperatives and also municipal utilities. I want to start by acknowledging all of the collaborators I've had the great fortune to work with on this set of topics related to munis and co-ops. So I have a really excellent research group of about 12 grad students, postdocs, and research staff. We've also been working very closely with a group called the Clean Energy Resource Teams, which is based out of Extension at the University of Minnesota, and has been a really important ally for us in building relationships. And that'll be a theme I come back to in this talk about how relationships outside of academia, I think, are really critical for understanding the dynamics that are at play, and finding ways to latch on to research opportunities and dissemination opportunities for the work we're doing. We've also been working very closely with the Great Plains Institute, which is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis, which has done a lot of important work and skill building around particularly convening in energy policy work. And they've been really key stakeholders for helping us do dynamic engagement processes, including very dynamic processes over Zoom that we've done over the last couple of months with some of our utility partners. Also working with researchers at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. And I mentioned here 4 researchers that my group's been collaborating with: Alex Klass at the Law School at University of Minnesota, Stephanie Lenhart at Boise State, Gilbert Michaud at Ohio University, and Elizabeth Wilson, who you heard from earlier. So as a quick entry point into what I'll be talking about today, I want to give just a very kind of high level overview of the landscape of utilities in the United States. There are 168 investor-owned utilities, but those investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, represent the majority of customers. 110 million customers are served by investor-owned utilities. But what I want to focus on today are the cooperatives and the municipal utilities. Municipal utilities here are under publicly owned, which also includes other publicly owned utilities such as federal, and there's some territorial and regional utilities. But if you look at this, you'll see that there are over 800 cooperatives, nearly 2,000 publicly owned utilities. And so there are many of these. They serve still about 40 million or so customers, so much smaller than IOUs, but by no means negligible. And I think what's really been important in this work is that these utilities are fundamentally different than IOUs. And the structure of these utilities requires a different kind of research and a different kind of engagement to make an impact in this space. So I want to lay out the landscape of munis and co-ops in the United States. What's shown here in blue are the parts of the country that are served by electric cooperatives. You can see that they cover the majority of the land area of the United States. Co-ops operate in 47 of the 50 states. Municipals are also scattered throughout. They're much harder to see because they're much smaller geographically, but some of them are quite large, but many of them, the majority of them, are very small. And together, they're about 23% of electricity sales across the country. What's really important to understand about the structure of munis and co-ops is that they operate in federated power supply networks. And so what this means is that while there are many, many of these utilities, they're actually working together in networks to source their power supply. And this is really important. When we look to some of the history of co-ops in particular, they have their roots in electrification of rural America. So going back to the time of the New Deal, when investor-owned utilities could not see a profit in serving rural parts of the country where there are very few customers per mile of line, the federal government stepped in and developed a number of programs to help incentivize and finance the development of utilities to serve rural customers. So many of these rural communities formed cooperatives, bottom-up, member-owned, not-for-profit utilities, and operated with locally sited generation and infrastructure. But quickly, the economics of power changed, where there were increasing economies of scale, particularly on the generation side, to go larger and larger, particularly with the advancement of coal technology. And so what happened was distribution utilities, these many small utilities shown in the previous figure, these small utilities separated by those thin black lines, banded together and formed what are called generation and transmission cooperatives on the co-op side, joint action agencies on the municipal side. These are, you can think of them as co-ops of co-ops. And so what's shown here are how these small distribution co-ops banded together to form these G&T families. And so now each of these different colors represents a set of electric cooperatives that are purchasing their power from the same generation and transmission co-op. And the way this actually works is that those distribution co-ops are owned by their individual members. So they don't have customers, they have member owners. So those individual end owners own their distribution utility. And ultimately, they also own the G&T. The way we like to think of this is they are co-ops of co-ops. So this structure is really important to understand. And this, I think, both illustrates the advantages and some of the disadvantage, or I should say the opportunities and the barriers of the cooperative structure, that they are ultimately member owned, but they operate in these federated structures that have created a lot of historic advantages and now some big challenges for how to evolve moving forward. So I want to just illustrate this with one of the cooperatives we're working with. We're currently working with a co-op called East River Electric. They're based in South Dakota and Minnesota. And here I've shown their territory. They serve 25 different distribution utilities across the 2 states. Those are shown there in the thin lines. So East River Electric is a transmission owning co-op. So they provide transmission services to the 25 members, and they also purchase wholesale power. They purchase wholesale power from 2 different power suppliers. One is Basin Electric, and one is the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA. So Basin is a co-op of co-ops. Basin operates in 9 states. It has multiple members that are sort of like East River. They're serving transmission services to their members. On the left, you can see Basin's service area. So East River owns Basin. The 25 members of East River own East River, and ultimately the members own those distribution members. WAPA is a federal power authority that is primarily based on hydroelectricity, and most of that power is allocated to co-ops. So in this structure, what you can see is that there are these multiple levels. So Basin ultimately owns most of the generation serving its members, or particularly in East River's case, all of the generation minus the WAPA allocation. And so this structure creates a lot of layers of institutional decision-making between the ultimate owners of the assets and the decision-making authorities operating across 9 states. When you look within East River, we're working with several of their distribution members. Here's one distribution member, Renville Sibley. It's ultimately governed by member owners who are elected from different districts shown here. And so, what I want to emphasize is that it's like peeling an onion working with cooperatives. There is, ultimately the final ownership are the members, but it goes through these multiple layers up to the scale of 9 different states covering a huge portion of the country from Canada to Mexico, where those decisions are ultimately made. And so this raises the question of how do you actually operate as a researcher to get your messages and to build capacity in the places where it can make the most impact. One more thing I just want to throw out here is that the governance structure of public utilities, including munis, co-ops, and IOUs is very different. Unlike IOUs, which are for-profit, munis and co-ops are not-for-profit. Co-ops are member-owned. Munis are owned by their city. The governance structure is quite different, where rural electric co-ops have member-elected boards. IOUs have private boards, like any private company, and munis are either appointed by city council or directly elected in some cases. So one more bit of context before jumping into some of the substance is that when we look by capacity, co-ops, public power, including munis and IOUs, look quite different. They're all experiencing a significant energy transition now, but they're at different points of that, having to do with geography, having to do with historic investments, having to do with financing opportunities. So nationally, coal is currently 23% of capacity and gas is 44%. If we look at co-ops, co-ops are 39% coal. Public power is 26% coal. I use 31% coal. Those don't add up because there are a lot of merchant generators that are mostly natural gas. If we look at the national coal capacity, though, IOUs own 51% of coal, merchants own 24%, public power owns 12%, co-ops own 9%. And so there's been a lot of focus from particularly environmental advocates on the coal ownership structure with co-ops and munis. And that's definitely important. And I think the point to emphasize here is that the landscape for particularly coal ownership is really changing in co-ops and munis. And the theories of change, or the opportunities to affect those decisions, are also really different. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how I've thought about engaging the policy process for IOUs as compared to munis and co-ops. I think for many people who spend a lot of time in the energy policy world, they're operating in something kind of like this framework. This is highly simplified. It's much more nuanced than this, but I think this is the kind of mental model I think that most people have when they think about engaging the energy policy process. And this is for IOUs. IOUs, or investor-owned utilities, have a very simple relationship with end users, and that is primarily based around selling energy. Now, with a lot of utility business model reform, that's changing to include things like incentivizing energy efficiency, for example. But primarily, this is a relationship based on customers and selling energy to customers. Then, because of the structure that we have where most IOUs are still monopolies, there's a lot of regulation. And so there's involvement by state and federal government and by regulatory bodies, primarily state and federal utility commission. So how does this generally work? Well, the end users or the customers are also voters, and they elect state and federal government. Particularly state governments will appoint members of a public utility commission or public service commission, and that public utility commission will regulate the IOUs. And there can also, of course, be state and federal legislation directly applying to the utilities. So as a clean energy advocate or as a clean energy researcher expert, where are the points to plug in? Well, I would say primarily the points to plug in are at regulation and legislation. So for regulation, it's very common for experts to plug in as witnesses. This is something that I've done in some of the work in Minnesota related to the community solar program and the value of solar tariff. We've provided our own assessment of specific dockets and provided that input into formal processes like a comment process or a witness process. Also in legislation, in my group, we've done direct testimony in front of the legislature with pending legislation. And again, there's a very formal process. You're invited to testify, you prepare written testimony and deliver that. And so those interventions are very sort of formal processes with clear entry points and regularly take a lot of expert input. But the world of co-ops and munis is quite different. So I've now done another cartoon, but for how co-ops and munis are governed. And I tried to mirror some of the previous graphs too to align these. So the co-ops, again, don't have customers, they have member owners. And so the end users of the co-op own the utility. And so it's a fundamentally different relationship. It's more of a bi-directional relationship where the co-op is serving the members and also anticipating what the members want. The end users elect a board. Those boards are elected through elections that look different across the country, but generally follow pretty standard democratic processes. And that utility board provides oversight and governance for the co-op. Public utility commissions and state and federal government do provide some governance, but it's much more limited in comparison to IOUs. And so this begs the question now, where's the opportunity to plug in as a researcher or as an advocate into this landscape? And I think it's really different. So I think it's much more about stakeholder engagement and capacity building and partnerships. So because the oversight roles are much less with co-ops and munis, and because those processes are much less formal or much less frequent, the opportunities here for partnering and engagement are much more available. That because co-ops are member owned, they have a natural incentive to find ways to serve their members. And for a university, there can be a lot of alignment there in figuring out ways to build capacity to help utilities meet the goals of their members and therefore also the public interest. I showed one more piece here, which is that, reflecting that federated structure of co-ops and munis, there's actually this G&T level where the individual distribution utilities are member owners of the G&T. The distribution utility boards select members of their boards to be on the G&T boards. There's a whole nother layer of governance. And so there's sort of a more complicated version of the story also at play when you take into account this multi-level structure. So over the past 3 or 4 years, my group, along with the collaborators started with, has really dug into engaging with co-ops and munis. And we found, as I mentioned before, a lot of alignment in doing so. I think first is being at a land-grant public university with an extension mission, and there's a natural alignment for finding opportunities to translate science for practical application. That's the actual language extensions use about their mission. And I think that for us as researchers, there is a really important opportunity to think through how can we connect our work into places where there hasn't been a lot of research attention and capacity building from the academic community in the past. And so I would say that if you look at Google Scholar or any search, there's a lot of presumption in energy policy work that utilities are investor owned and have incentives that align with investor owned utilities. But it's fundamentally different in co-ops and munis, and therefore I think requires a specific tailored kind of research. There's also a significant heterogeneity and internal capacity across munis and co-ops, and also access to expertise. Just as we spent several years in one of our earlier projects with Stephanie Lenhard and Elizabeth Wilson, actually talking with utilities. And one of the striking things for me in this experience was understanding that for some utilities, they have 5 employees, some maybe as few as 3 full-time employees operating a distribution utility. And so there's really significant heterogeneity in their capacity to access expertise. And then finally, there's some really distinct challenges and opportunities that I think research partnerships and engagement can identify if there's partnerships with co-ops and munis in particular. Because co-ops and munis have a different set of organizing principles that's not about shareholder profit, but about member benefit, I think there are some specific things that can be achieved under the structure that can't be achieved otherwise. So as a kind of example of some of the distinct challenges and opportunities with munis and co-ops, I want to lay out one advantage and one challenge of the co-op model. So one of the advantages that we found in our work has been the history of load management deployment in co-ops and munis. So cooperatives have been some of the earliest adopters of load management technology. So things like smart water heaters, for example. And this is a technology that's really been embraced by a lot of cooperatives. It allows them to shift their peak load by remotely controlling when a water heater fires. Load management works in the co-op model because it creates benefits that are aligned with existing power supply relationships. So I mentioned before this federated structure that many co-ops are in. That federated structure is undergirded by a set of contracts for energy services between the distribution utilities and their power suppliers. And oftentimes the form of those contracts includes a pretty significant demand charge for peak demand. And so load management can really align with overall system benefits. And one of the facts of load management in general, one of the technical facts, is that there are greater potential benefits from avoiding demand charges when you can have higher levels of coordination. In other words, you can get more system benefit when you coordinate with more load. Right? The more load you can shift, the more total benefit there is. And so co-ops, through their existing structures, both have the incentive through the demand charge and power supply contracts, and also the structure to share the benefits of load management through their power supply networks. And so this is a real distinct advantage. And we see empirically that co-ops have deployed a lot more load management, whereas IOUs do not have that same incentive to lower peak load over the long term in the absence of policy. On the flip side, one of the big challenges with the co-op model in particular has been fitting in with many state policies. We've been working in Minnesota where there's a net metering statute, actually the first net metering statute in the country, and it applied to munis, co-ops, and IOUs equally. And that's created some challenges because of the unique natures of the co-op business model. Some of what we heard from the managers that we talked to was that the net metering was creating cross-subsidy and the potential for stranded assets. And the sentiment that we heard multiple times was that co-ops are different. They have lower density, they have higher proportions of radial feeders, and they have land areas that are much larger and therefore allow for system sizing above load. And so what this means is that the combination of these factors can make the cross-subsidization concern with net metering in general much more acute for particularly small co-ops. And the challenge here is that the, the principles of net metering, I think are that compensation for excess outflow generation from distributed generation creates value approximately equal to the retail rate. But for co-ops, that could really differ when they have really high fixed costs and a rate structure very much based on volumetric rates. And so there's a sense that amongst many of the co-ops we talk to, that net metering creates the opportunity for individuals to benefit a lot from deploying DG, but that in a way that conflicts with the co-op values. And so, when we think about net metering with IOUs, oftentimes this is seen as an important strategy for opening up the utility to competition, or sometimes we hear about energy democracy in relation to net metering. But with co-ops, I think that there's a real concern that net metering could be a barrier to transforming the utility business model. We heard things like net metering is creating such a large cost to recover from our other members that is preventing us from doing other things, or it's leading us to put on higher fixed fees onto our members and not leading to system transformation. So with that, I want to talk about now how we're applying a lot of these principles, both thinking through the advantages and challenges of the co-op model, and also how to engage co-ops in a specific project. So in just the last 5 minutes or so that I have, I want to talk about a project that we're doing with East River Electric. So we're currently working on a DOE grant through the Solar Energy Innovation Network with 5 distribution utilities and their transmission provider, East River, on a project to look at innovative models for solar deployment. So as part of our strategy and thinking through how can we as a university meet our organizational objectives as a land grant university and also affect change in this space, we decided to go for a direct partnership with a group of utilities, also bringing in together the Clean Energy Resource teams and the Great Plains Institute to provide key facilitation and technical expertise, as well as a technical consulting firm that works with a lot of rural utility Star Energy Services. And so what we're doing in this project is we're looking to identify organizational models to deploy solar in co-ops that equitably creates benefits for members across that multi-tiered structure. What's really important about this project is that we're thinking about what are the key barriers to solar in co-ops. It really has been this sense that solar, if done through traditional mechanisms like net metering, creates cross-subsidy. So we're thinking through is, okay, if that's the key barrier, how could we design models with utilities that avoid cross-subsidy? So we're looking for different kinds of organizational and financial design to enable this. So we're doing a big kind of survey of case studies and models of solar deployment in co-ops, in munis, and other kinds of utilities to think through how are benefits created, how are benefits quantified, and how can different kinds of contractual and financial design share those benefits so that everyone is made whole and others are made better off and no one is harmed. So we're working with utilities to understand their decision-making process. A big part of this project has been to work with our facilitators to understand exactly how these utilities make their decisions. Because there's so much autonomy and because they're locally controlled utilities, the decision-making process of co-ops and munis are really different than IOUs. IOUs have to go through a very formal decision-making process that's vetted at every stage by the regulatory process. Whereas co-ops and munis can make those decisions solely within their membership. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to uncover some of the principles and metrics that guide decision-making at these utilities. Then ultimately, what we're going to be doing is developing these models that create tangible and realistic benefits. Co-ops and munis also have specific accounting practices that differ from IOUs. And so we're also trying to understand exactly how their balance sheets work, so that we can create models that really fit with exactly how their practices operate. So as we think about this big structure, what we're doing is we're building up a lot of modeling capabilities. This is kind of a cartoon of the model we're building. What we're thinking through is how, if you deploy solar at different scales, at the distribution level, if you do it behind the meter or if you do it in front of the meter, if you install solar at the transmission scale, what happens to costs and benefits across different members? So I think the kind of classic way of thinking about net metering is that if you put solar on your roof, how much is your neighbor next door paying for that? Or how much are they benefiting from that? And so we're taking that, but really now expanding this into this multi-level structure where we have individual members, we have rate classes, we have distribution members on the same contract with the power supplier, and then we have East River, which is within this much larger basin network. And we're thinking through, if we put solar at these different scales, what are the implications for cost and benefit shifts across the system? Thinking through avoided energy costs, capacity related, any kind of monetizable other credits such as environmental benefits. And so the real challenge here is we're developing this modeling framework where we can put solar at different points in the system and then watch as values flow throughout the system. And we're building off a lot of the experience with quantifying solar cost benefits and applying this now in a very different context than traditionally that's been developed. Okay, so I will run through this and just end here, and then we can go to Q&A, which is saying, I think some of the big open questions for how to work in this space with co-ops and munis are thinking through, as we think about utility 2.0 kind of ideas, well, what does this mean in muni and co-ops? How does the muni and co-op business model how does the co-op muni business model need to evolve while still maintaining the cooperative principles of serving members, being locally controlled? How does that need to evolve for higher levels of distributed energy resources? And in particular, how does the relationship with their generation and transmission provider need to evolve moving forward? Some other open questions are how to engage members for greater participatory governance. A lot of co-ops and munis have come under fire for being member-owned, but not being truly democratic in their processes. But at the same time, I think there are many positive examples of munis and co-ops. These are, in many ways, utilities that have adopted many of the principles that undergird the energy democracy movement. And so what lessons could we learn from co-ops and munis for thinking about other parts of the energy system? And then finally, I think a really big part of the work we're doing is also trying to build learning across co-ops and munis. Because there are so many of these utilities, we really think it can be fruitful to build more of these peer exchanges across utilities. All right, that was almost exactly 30 minutes. So thanks a lot, and I think we can go to Q&A now.
That was really perfect, Gabe. Thank you so much. I've always really appreciated how your work tries to understand the system from many different angles and perspectives. And this latest work on financial modeling really allows us to ask and understand how technologies can affect value to different members at different places. I don't think that's thought about enough. We often look at just the cost of the technology without asking who benefits and who doesn't. And for co-ops, some of the poorest areas of America, serving some of the poorest areas of America, this is particularly important. The questions asked that have come in so far, and please feel free to type your question in the box and we'll be able to answer them as well. Are there ever any cases of corruption in co-ops if profits aren't equitably or fairly distributed back to the member owners, or if profits are unfairly withheld? It's one of the questions.
Yeah, I think because co-ops are member-owned, like any kind of co-op, there's patronage. And I think there's been a big movement to try to unlock some of that patronage capital. There's credits that are sometimes tied up or reinvested. It's complicated. And, this, of course, like the bad stories get a lot of attention. I think some of the good stories perhaps don't get enough attention. And I have not seen systematic analysis of this, but, there are co-ops are, because of their history in the New Deal, have a lot of connections with USDA and receive a lot of their financing through USDA. And there are also specific programs, Red Lake being one of them, that enable co-ops to be, or intend co-ops to be engines of local economic growth. And so there are special financing provisions for co-ops to invest in their communities. And so this can look like investing in energy efficiency for a school or upgrading a fire station and things like that in rural parts of the country. But of course, I think, with economic development, there's there can be a slippery slope into, what can look like corrupt projects. And, quick Google can show you there are probably some in many states, but I think that probably a future research direction could be trying to understand to what extent these local economic development opportunities co-ops are given are, or to what extent they're positive, and what those metrics might be. But certainly there are examples of corruption in co-ops.
There was a question here. Can you break down further the pros and cons of munis versus co-ops? Also, what are the operational differences between munis, co-ops, and is it common for munis to own transmission and generation? You covered that, but maybe just, again, a brief summary of that for our audience.
Yeah, so I think this was the pros and cons of munis versus co-ops. I think that was the question. I'm not sure if it was munis and co-ops versus IOUs, but to take it as written, I think that munis are obviously within a township, and co-ops are much more spread out. So munis have much denser customers per mile line compared to co-ops. Co-ops have a relationship with USDA, and so that's very unique. Whereas munis have relationships with cities, obviously, and that provides opportunities to use some of the city balance sheet for financing as well. So you have some things where a municipal utility may either be contributing to or drawing from other funds within the municipal budget. So there's different kinds of flexibility within munis versus co-ops. I think the question was also about owning generation and transmission, and yeah, so they primarily own that through their power supplier networks, the joint action agencies or the G&T co-ops. Although, it's different across the country. There's a lot of wheeling going on across co-op systems too.
A lot of your research has looked at distributed energy resources. A question from Andrew Alley. What is one specific way muni and co-op business models can change to fit a future with higher DER adoption, distributed energy resource adoption?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, I think this is a lot of what we've been thinking about. One of the specific barriers to higher DER adoption is kind of the classic barrier, but manifested very specifically with co-ops and munis, which has to do with stranded assets. That co-ops and munis made big investments in centralized generation. They did that through their G&T vehicle, which then was made financeable through power supply contracts. Many of the contracts between G&Ts and the individual distribution utilities are what's called all requirements contracts, which essentially limits the distribution utility from sourcing power from any other source. And so what this looks like in terms of challenges for DER are some really interesting, I should say, this is the Minnesota the interesting proceedings at FERC.
Better explain that, because we have an international audience here.
Minnesota interesting means makes me a little uncomfortable, I guess. There's some really good proceedings you can read in public filings at FERC of distribution utilities arguing that their power supply contract with the G&T is unfair. And that's certainly been one perception of a barrier. But the question was, what can change in this space to enable higher DERs? And I think that there could be a lot of rethinking of those power supply contracts in a way to be made more flexible to DERs. And so what could that look like? I think essentially the principles could be how to pass through the potential market value of DERs down through the distribution utilities so that incentives are aligned and distribution utilities can deploy DERs in a way where they're fairly compensated for system value and they're not creating cross subsidy. And I think that the co-ops are perfectly situated to do exactly that. And I think what that would look like is more dynamic power supply contracts that move beyond simple structures of energy and demand charges to much more complex things. And I think there's a perfect analogy to what we see with retail rate design reform with things like time of use rates or more dynamic pricing. I think that exactly those same kind of principles could be applied in a very different institutional context in different ways for those wholesale power supply agreements.
Will the models that you're developing help to evaluate the implications of some of those different pricing schemes as well?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. I think we're thinking about specifically solar deployment, but we want to understand, what's the capacity value of that? What's the energy value of that? How does that affect the existing power supply relationship? And therefore, how much benefit could be created? And then how to allocate that so that it's not one distribution member benefiting on the backs of the others, but rather everyone's benefiting together. And that kind of benefit sharing idea, I think, is very much ingrained in the co-op family we're working with, due in particular to their history with doing this exact thing with load management.
I noted when I looked at the participants that Steve Camarino, the head of the New Hampshire co-ops, was on the call as well. So Steve, if you want to weigh in with a question or comment, we'd love to hear from you. State policy. Alex Class, University of Minnesota, asked, to what extent can state policy drive better corporate management of co-ops to drive clean energy transitions? Are there any states that do this better than others?
Yeah, there's been a pretty big movement for, I think particularly amongst a lot of advocates to something's called remember the electric cooperative. So putting the members back in higher positions of power. And I think there's the potential for some regulation there, although there are also so many challenges with that. We learned specifically of one challenge in the Minnesota context, but I think it's emblematic of this, which is that a group of environmental sort of advocates went to all the co-ops in the state and tried to see if they could figure out the specific fuel mix of each co-op, and found that most co-op websites did not list this information. And so started to advocate for state regulation of sort of just disclosure to give members more power in their decision making, and advocated for legislation to require certain kinds of information, sort of sunshine rules. And the co-ops responded saying that that's very hard information to provide because we only have 3 employees and we need to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we can't make our website. We don't have the bandwidth to upgrade our website. So I think what this illustrates, and no one's ever complained inside our membership. And so I think this illustrates some of the real tensions about, how do you legislate in such a diverse landscape for something like member engagement? So I think it's challenging. I think certainly people are thinking about this, though.
This actually goes in really well to our next question. Can you speculate on possibilities for democratization of IOUs? This feels increasingly urgent and also hugely challenging. Do co-ops provide any lessons for this?
Yeah, actually, Stephanie Lenhart and Elizabeth, you and I are all working on some of these ideas about, we have this experience with energy democracy. A lot of the energy democracy thinking is actually centered around co-ops, but more the European co-ops than the US co-ops. But the US co-ops have been around longer and are much more established. What can we learn from that? I think that part of what we can learn is that the structure of the utility, I think, provides not necessarily a guarantee of more democracy, but opportunities for that. And I think that as we enter this new sort of possibility space for electricity change and energy transition, that those structures become, I think, important vehicles for how to achieve broader public benefit. And so what does that really mean? I think it means that there is member accountability, and so those structures could be utilized to create more accountability for members. And so if we want people to be more engaged with their energy system because they have a smart thermostat or because they're generating power on site, well, now we have an accountability structure already in place through the co-op that could be utilized for more sort of attention and responsiveness to individual member needs, which I think ultimately is one of the key pillars for energy democracy. So, I'd say the high level, my thought is that the co-op structure creates a lot of opportunities for democratic accountability, but it doesn't guarantee it. That, it's kind of like, just because you can vote doesn't mean there's democratic accountability in our political system, that you really have to participate in the democratic process for there to be real change.
And there was just a clarification question, somebody asking, Ted Montgomery asking for a definition of cross subsidy.
Yeah, actually, in our formal academic work, we don't use that term. Cross subsidy is used a lot in practice. I like to use the kind of word value flow, which is a little bit more wonky, but cross subsidy essentially means that one person is paying for someone else. It's an external cost.
Mm-hmm. So this right now. Working at home. Can you discuss issues regarding access to capital for co-ops and munis, and about whether any co-ops and munis are considering privatization?
I think we're seeing a little bit of the reverse. I think both. You see in some places, like we had a case in Minnesota where some IOU territory was actually taken over by co-ops. I think that there are some complexities going on behind the scenes with how, particularly the generation side is financed. That there has been some increased involvement of private sources of capital, refinancing what had been federally underwritten co-op debt. That's a little bit more complicated and harder to understand exactly what's happening there. But I think that certainly the financing side is complicated, and I think I still have more to learn there.
It's a really interesting. Actually, this leads in well to our next week's talk that will be on energy financing. So I'll plug that right now, or 2 weeks from now. Any unique difficulties engaging and communicating with munis and co-ops?
Yeah, I think that
this is from Queen and Queen.
Yeah, I think unlike IOUs, they have no obligation to listen to you. I think IOUs have to listen to you if you submit a comment. They have to respond to it. And if you're testifying, you have the floor. But co-ops and munis have no such obligation. And so I think that there's a huge process of trust building. One of the researchers I've had the privilege of meeting, Keith Taylor, talks about this notion of appreciative inquiry. Mm-hmm. Basically the idea of, how do you do work that helps support the organizational mission of others while still remaining an academic researcher? And I think, that's been an important concept for us to grapple with. How do you provide, how do you achieve the land grant mission of extending knowledge and research insights to where it can be most useful? Do that in a way where they have no obligation to listen to you, and so therefore you have to build trust, and also not become kind of agents of the utilities or agents of others, and still maintain that impartiality. So I think for us, it's been really important to emphasize at the beginning of all the projects that what we bring is our objectiveness, to the extent that anyone is objective, but we bring a research perspective. We don't have an agenda except to be helpful. And so we try to partner and find alignments with the research scope. But, I think it's been really important to go through, a lot of trust building. I think I spend, for all of these projects, more than half of my time on relationship management compared to actual technical work.
Yeah, that's a huge component. There's a question from Steve Camarino, who runs the co-ops here in New Hampshire. And he asks, have you observed any unique challenges to effective cooperative governance posed by single issue concerns becoming the driving force in the director election process? For example, climate change, broadband.
Yeah. I haven't seen that in the co-ops that we're working with. Elizabeth, it looks like you're still talking, but I can't hear you right now. I don't know if that's just me. But to answer this question, I can see it here. I think that some of this has certainly happened. There's particularly in Colorado, I think there are a few examples where there have been some of these, both the management and the board elections where single issues or a small set of issues can really come to dominate. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen that too much in our area where we've been working in the upper Midwest. certainly I've heard those kinds of stories.
There's a question here from Clifton Bella, who's a Lebanon town manager here in New Hampshire, talking about democratizing electricity supply and community power aggregations. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of your work with community solar projects or how community power aggregations are in any of the conversations with your municipalities or cooperatives.
Yeah, so co-ops and munis have been early adopters of community solar as well. We actually just did a webinar 2 weeks ago on a big database of community solar projects across the country, and it's something like 40 states have community solar projects now. Most of those through co-ops and munis. I think that those are important programs and really fit again with the co-op model. It's an opt-in program where you can design a contract for virtual power supply that can recover all the costs as part of the contract. And so there's a lot of alignment there with what co-ops can want. I think that this broader question of what are the multiple strategies to engage end users in energy decision making, I think that's a big kind of question for energy democracy and energy transition. I think things like community solar are going a long way. There's kind of an evolution, I think, from green pricing. Green pricing where you just kind of check a box and pay a couple cents extra and you get a virtual credit. I think this is the next level now to move towards actually changing your power supply, but again, it's very virtual. And then, there's of course the on-site installation of efficiency, demand response, or even generation. I think that takes it to one more level. So how are co-ops unique in this? I think that they can design structures for incentivizing these DERs and other kinds of clean energy programs. But I think because they're member followed, they don't have the same kind of, let's say, depth or financing via ratepayer programs that a lot of IOUs have done. So the biggest community solar program in the country is Minnesota's Excel program, its IOU program, which is funded through a rider, essentially, in the fuel clause. And so that's how that program is essentially financed through the rider, which goes to subscribers, which underwrites the subscription contract, which ultimately goes to private developers. Co-ops don't have that same kind of ability. I mean, they technically have that ability, but don't have that mandate in the same kind of way. And so I think that the kinds of customer engagement and opt-in programs, these kind of green tariff programs, green pricing programs, voluntary green power programs, those look different in co-ops because they have to be designed in a way that accounts for that potential cross-subsidy.
We started this series to be able to hear voices of the energy research community of the future. And we're really thankful that you took up the first inaugural talk. But I'd like to just end as a last question before we go on to kind of the next events piece of what do you think the most exciting topics are on the horizon? When you're kind of thinking about your next research projects for all the graduate students and others who are on this call and others coming after you, what do you see as the really interesting topics that are on the horizon and going to be shaping this research agenda for the next couple of decades?
Yeah, I think that, it's hard to ignore, and kind of coming back full circle, it's hard to ignore what's going on in the rest of the world, outside of energy and dealing with systemic racism and income inequality and let's not forget there's a climate crisis going on at the same time underneath all of this. And I think that one of the most important sort of responsibilities we have is to think through how are these issues related? And if they're not related, how can we make them related? Because, I think that, if we don't see those connections, then we're leaving a huge opportunity on the table. And that I think if we don't see the connections between people's everyday lives and the livelihoods of future generations, then we'll miss the boat. And so I think, finding those connections in research and how to actually move that into practice as quickly as possible is, what's motivating me.
Well, honestly, Gabe, it's been really inspiring to see your research agenda grow over the last year since you've come to University of Minnesota from MIT. And I am thankful that you were able to give this talk here today. Stephanie, could you share the events that are coming up next? We have a whole series planned. The next 2 talks, it's on the website and the link that you have there. We'll be sharing it with all of our university partners. I also welcome you to send us names of faculty members who you think would be good for this series. Again, our goal is to hear from assistant professors, postdocs, and researchers on energy and society related issues. And as you mentioned, linking livelihood and lives, energy and society is really critical, and paying for that will be something that we're talking about in the next. Bjarne Steffen, a senior researcher who works with Toby Schmidt at ETH Zurich, will be talking about the role of finance in the low carbon energy transition. And they've done some really exciting work looking at finance of renewable energy technologies, renewable projects in developing countries as well. So that'll be a very exciting talk. And then 2 weeks after that, on July 1st, Parth Vaishnav will be talking about electrify everything. And so thinking about how electrification can transform all sectors of our society. And again, we're trying to put together a series of talks that will have us thinking about the energy futures in really critical ways. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming today to this inaugural talk. And I'm glad you got to meet my bonus son, Sophus. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for attending.
And I just want to thank who you can't see, Stephanie Garcia, for her help with all of the logistics and the website. Thank you, Stephanie. That's been really, really great to have you here supporting us too. Okay. Bye, everyone. We'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks.